Today we're going to talk a little bit about identifying cattle and types of identification, and specifically focusing on hot iron and cold iron branding of cattle. When we think about why we identify cattle, most people think of first and foremost to identify cattle from an ownership perspective, or putting a holding brand on them, and so that they have some way to identify their cattle and show their ownership of their cattle from anybody else within their area, their county, or within the state. So it gives an opportunity to provide some ownership for those animals. The next reason that we identify cattle in a production scenario would be identification from a management standpoint. So we can identify individual animals within a herd so that we can collect some data on them, and it may be calving records or individual performance records or something to that standpoint. Then we move on to identifying cattle that may be some kind of numerical identification from a registration standpoint, and that could be either a tattoo or a brand. And then also we utilize identification for state or federal government health programs, and a prime example in the cattle industry would be the brucellosis program and the tattoos and the metal clips that were utilized to put some kind of identification in those cattle to show when they were vaccinated and that they had been vaccinated. So when we think about identification, lots of different reasons why we identify cattle. Today we're going to focus on two different aspects, and when we think about branding, we're thinking about branding either for an ownership, so you put your farm or ranch brand on your animal to identify it as being your animal, or we think about branding also from an individual identification of animals, and that could be putting some kind of number or some kind of lettering system on those cattle, and that could be for your own record-keeping purposes or for registration within a respective breed association. So when we think about ID, let's talk about ownership and the importance of ownership. Cattle theft, or from what we used to term cattle rustling, is still alive and well. And when we think about the year of 2009, and we look at the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Organization, which is the law enforcement organization of the cattle industry, and they have seen their numbers of cattle theft double and triple over the past couple of years. And so it has increased, and cattle theft or cattle rustling is an extremely important issue at this day and age. And one of the most effective ways for Texas and Southwestern cattle raisers, law enforcement officials, to be able to recover your cattle is when those cattle have been permanently identified, and most likely it's going to be with a hot iron brand, and in some instances on darker hided cattle it may be with a freeze brand. But permanently identifying them through the brand is the most effective way to be able to identify cattle that may have been stolen when they run through a local livestock auction and somebody's trying to sell them, or to identify them if they may have somebody stole them and put them on their piece of property. So the branding is the most effective way. Cattle can be recovered even if they're not branded, but the likelihood of that happening is a lot less. When cattle that don't have a brand, they run through the marketplace, it's a lot harder to figure out if those cattle had been stolen or not. Because if we think about the cattle and at this day, the predominant color within the cattle industry is probably black-hided cattle, and also solid colored cattle. And so there's not a lot of visible or distinguishing color identifying characteristics to help identify them.